In the summer of 1952, in a dry arroyo in the San Pedro Valley of Arizona, archaeologists lifted the bones of a single mammoth out of the bank and counted 8 stone spear points lying in among them. 5 were in the chest cavity. The hunters had struck this animal, and then they had lost it. Their weapons stayed inside the body for roughly 13,000 years. It is the most famous weapon ever found inside a mammoth in North America. And it did not change the human timeline. It proved the one everybody already believed. The weapon that actually broke the story was invisible for 30 years, buried inside a different rib, in a bog in Washington state, held by a man the field had quietly written off. This is the story of the wall Arizona helped build, the sites that cracked it, and the object waiting in a museum drawer for a machine that could see inside bone. To understand why that bone point mattered so much, you have to understand how solid the wall was and where the strongest bricks in it came from. They came from Arizona. The valley of the San Pedro River, running north out of Mexico into the desert southeast of Tucson, turned out to hold something almost no other landscape on the continent could offer. Ancient stream beds where the bones of Ice Age animals and the tools of the people who killed them lay sealed together in the same layer of earth. Naco was the first. Emil Haury of the University of Arizona excavated it in 1952, and what he found was a kill without a meal. 8 points in one mammoth, and no cut marks anywhere on the skeleton. The hunters had wounded the animal, and the animal had walked away from them and died alone. 3 years later, a rancher named Ed Lenner led Haury to a second site 11 kilometers upstream, and that one was different. 13 points, the remains of roughly 13 mammoths, and bison, horse, tapir, and camel besides. And, critically, hearths. Charcoal. Something that could be radiocarbon dated. That is what Lenner gave the field. Naco proved that people had hunted mammoths in America. Lenner put a number on it. In 1966, Vance Haynes began work at a third site in the same valley, Murray Springs, and pulled from it a shaft wrench carved from mammoth bone, along with a layer of black sediment that seemed to seal the whole Clovis world shut at once. 3 sites, 1 valley. Arizona was where Clovis stopped being a beautiful stone point and became a date. And around that date, a story hardened. People had crossed from Siberia over the Bering Land Bridge near the end of the last ice age. They had walked south through an ice-free corridor between the great ice sheets. They had arrived roughly 13,000 years ago, and they had spread across 2 continents with astonishing speed, hunting the largest animals in the hemisphere with those fluted points. Clovis first, nothing human before it, and it is worth saying plainly how total that was. It was in the textbooks. It was on the museum labels. Careers were built on it. Dissertations were written inside it. Funding was awarded according to it. It was not treated as a hypothesis anymore. It was the floor. And when the floor finally gave way, it did not give way to a better stone point. It gave way to a weapon made of the wrong material, in the wrong place, found by the wrong man. In 1977, a farmer named Emmanuel Manis was digging a pond on his land outside Sequim, Washington, on the northern edge of the Olympic Peninsula. Everyone called him Manny. His backhoe went down into the soft ground and hit something hard, and when he climbed out to look, he was standing over a pair of tusks. He had found a mastodon. Carl Gustafson, an archaeologist from Washington State University, came out to excavate. What he was working in was not ordinary soil. It was an old bog, waterlogged and starved of oxygen, and bog chemistry does something remarkable. It stops decay. Bone that should have rotted into nothing thousands of years ago was still lying there, intact enough to handle. And in among that skeleton, Gustafson found a rib with something sticking out of it. He looked at it, and he said what he thought it was. A weapon. Evidence that people had been hunting mastodons on this coast around 14,000 years ago. He could not prove it. That is the thing to hold on to. In 1977, he had no way to look inside a bone. He could not see the shape of the object buried in it, only the small piece protruding from the surface. His dating methods were cruder than what we have now, and he could not rule out the alternatives, because there were real alternatives. Bone grows spurs. Objects get pressed into carcasses during burial by nothing more than the weight of sediment and time. So the field did what fields do with evidence that arrives too early. It shrugged. Maybe a spur, maybe disturbance, maybe a man who wanted his sight to matter more than it did. And here is the uncomfortable part, the part that makes this story worth telling honestly. The objection was not stupid. The layer had sealed the object. The date came from the bone itself. So if you wanted to keep Clovis first standing, you had exactly two moves available to you. Call the point natural or call the date contaminated. And calling it natural was easier to say, easier to publish, easier on everyone's career. The easiest way to bury a discovery is not to destroy it. It is to make the person holding it look careless. For 30 years, Manus stayed a footnote in the literature, the site people mentioned in passing and then moved past. And Gustafson stayed the man who overread a bone. One farm in Washington can be a fluke. One stubborn archaeologist can be wrong. But Manus was never alone. Because thousands of miles south of that Washington bog, at the far end of the other American continent, a site had already begun tearing the whole wall down. It is called Monte Verde. It sits in southern Chile, on the banks of a small creek in cool, wet forest country, and it was excavated across the 1970s and 80s by an American archaeologist named Tom Dillahay. What made Monte Verde a nightmare for Clovis first was the same thing that made Manus remarkable: a peat bog. Waterlogged ground had preserved the parts of human life that stone almost never leaves behind for us: wood, hearths, worked plants, even what appeared to be a footprint pressed into ancient ground and held there. This was not a scatter of flakes that might be natural. This looked like a place where people had lived, and the dates came back around 14,500 years. That is older than Clovis, but sit with where it is, because the location is doing more work than the number. Monte Verde is roughly 16,000 kilometers from the Bering Land Bridge. If people were already living that far south, at the bottom of two continents, 14,500 years ago, then the arrival has to be earlier still, considerably earlier. The date does not just beat Clovis, it requires a whole chapter that comes before Clovis. For years, Monte Verde was attacked exactly the way Manus had been. Too old, too messy. Must be wrong. And then, in 1997, something rare happened. A panel of senior archaeologists, including some of the model's most committed skeptics, flew to Chile to look at it themselves. They walked the site. They went through the collections. They examined the evidence in person, and most of them agreed. Monte Verde was real, and it was that old. That was the crack going public. That was the moment the field admitted, in print and with signatures on it, that the wall had a hole in it. But look at what it actually took to get there. It did not take one rib in a bog. It took a delegation of experts physically traveling to the far end of South America before the discipline would concede a point the evidence had been making for nearly 20 years. Resistance was not the exception here. Resistance was the default setting. And once Monte Verde held, every North American site that had been quietly laughed off deserved a second look. Starting with a man who had been fighting since the 1970s and who paid for it longer than almost anyone. In southwestern Pennsylvania, about 50 kilometers from Pittsburgh, there is a sandstone overhang above a creek called Cross Creek. It is known as the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, and for more than 40 years it has been excavated by an archaeologist named James Adovasio. Adovasio was, by reputation, one of the most meticulous excavators of his generation. He dug in fine levels. He recorded everything. He built a stratigraphic record so careful that even people who hated his conclusions conceded the quality of the work. And what that record showed was human occupation reaching down past 16,000 years, possibly further. Not marginally older than Clovis, dramatically older. Thousands of years of people living under that overhang before the first fluted point was ever supposed to have been made in the Americas. The critics had a real objection, and this is where honesty matters. Meadowcroft sits in coal country. Groundwater moving through ground like that can carry ancient carbon, dissolved out of coal deposits that are millions of years old. And ancient carbon, if it gets into your sample, can make a radiocarbon date read older than the thing you are actually dating. That is a legitimate scientific concern. It is not gatekeeping to raise it. Any archaeologist working in that geology would have to answer for it. But here's the twist. A reasonable objection can also become a very convenient door. Because as long as contamination remained possible, the old model never had to change. Nobody needed to disprove Meadowcroft. Nobody needed to demonstrate that the carbon had actually moved, or show contamination in the samples, or explain why the dates ran in clean stratigraphic order from top to bottom, which is not what randomly contaminated dates tend to do. Possible was enough. Possible did all the work. And so Adovasio spent a career, decades of it, defending one site against the same recycled doubt. He tested. He published. He answered the objection, and the objection came back, and he answered it again. He was not simply arguing for a date. He was arguing against the shape of his entire discipline, and a discipline is a heavy thing to argue with. Notice that there is no villain in this. Nobody conspired against Meadowcroft. The field did not need a villain. It had inertia. And inertia does not have to be cruel to end a career slowly. What the old model needed, if it was ever going to move, was evidence that contamination could not explain away. Something that could not have leached in through groundwater. Something that had, at some point, been alive and human. And in the high desert of south central Oregon, in a set of dry rock shelters overlooking an ancient lake basin, that is exactly what turned up. The site is called the Paisley Caves. The archaeologist is Dennis Jenkins of the University of Oregon, and what his team recovered there is not the sort of artifact that ends up in a display case. They found coprolites, ancient human waste dried by the desert air and preserved in the cave sediment for thousands of years. And inside them, still readable, ancient human DNA. The dates ran back around 14,300 years. Understand what that changed about the argument. Every fight up to this point had been about interpretation. Is that shaped stone a tool, or is it a rock that broke in a way that flatters us? Is that mark on the rib a wound, or is it a spur? Paisley did not offer anything to interpret. This was not an object somebody made. This was a person. Their own biology, left behind in a cave floor, carrying their genetic signature down through 14,000 years. The critics did not concede. They adjusted. And their new objection was, again, a fair one. DNA is mobile. It is a molecule in water, and water moves down through sediment. Genetic material from younger layers above could have leached downward into older deposits below, and you would end up dating the sediment correctly, while dating the person entirely wrong. So Jenkins and his team went back and did the unglamorous work. They controlled the sediment. They sampled repeatedly across different coprolites and different parts of the deposit. They tested the layers immediately surrounding the specimens to see whether the contamination they were being accused of was actually there. Same answer. They tested again, and again the cave gave them the same answer. That was the problem for the old model. Every time the field pushed, Paisley pushed back with the identical result. You can call one sample contamination. You can call two an anomaly. It gets considerably harder when the cave keeps handing you the same date year after year from independent material. But there was a limitation built into the victory, and it is worth being honest about it. DNA is invisible. You cannot mount it on a museum wall. You cannot photograph it in a way that makes a general audience feel anything at all. What the argument still needed was tools. Real worked stone, sealed underneath a Clovis layer in ground where nothing human was supposed to exist. And a site in central Texas delivered exactly that. It sits on Buttermilk Creek, about 60 kilometers north of Austin, and it is formally known as the Deborah L. Friedkin site. The excavation was led by Michael Waters of Texas A&M University. And what his team pulled out of that ground was not a handful of ambiguous flakes. It was thousands of stone artifacts, blades, bifaces, scrapers, the debris of people making tools on that spot over and over again. And the artifacts were stratified below the Clovis layer in deposits dated to around 15,500 years. Slow down on the word below, because the word below is the whole game. There was a Clovis occupation at Friedkin, with the fluted points exactly where the textbooks said they should be, and underneath it, separated by clean sediment, sealed, was an older assemblage. That is not something that fell down a crack. That is not material that worked its way downward through the profile. You cannot drop thousands of artifacts through solid layered clay and have them arrive in neat chronological order, with the older material politely arranging itself at the bottom. The floor held them in place like a locked drawer, and when the drawer was opened, it said that somebody had been there first. Notice, too, who was holding the trowel. The man excavating tools from beneath Clovis in Texas was the same man who would later take a mastodon rib out of a museum collection in Washington state and put it into a scanner. Hold on to that. We will come back to it. Because by this point in the story, something had changed in the character of the evidence itself. A single strange sight is easy to dismiss. Manus could be a bone spur. Meadowcroft could be groundwater. Monte Verde could be a misread bog. Every one of them, taken alone, offered a critic something specific to grab. But this was no longer a scatter of unrelated oddities in separate corners of the map. It was Chile and Pennsylvania and Oregon and Texas. It was bone and wood and DNA and stone. Different states, different countries, different materials, different specialists, working with different methods and different biases, and all of them arriving at the same buried fact. The explanations for the individual sites still worked. The explanation for all of them at once did not. So the question stopped being whether people beat Clovis to the Americas. It became how. How did they get here this early and this widely spread out? And the answer pointed somewhere the old model had never bothered to look. In 2011, Michael Waters put Gustafson's rib into a CT scanner. The scan resolved what nobody could see in 1977, a shaped point made of bone driven into the rib and lodged there, and the bone had begun to heal around it. The animal was struck, and it lived a while afterwards. That is not a fossil that fell into a hole, that is a hunt. New dating locked it near 13,800 years. Gustafson was right. He had been right the whole time, and he was still alive to see it. And here's the complication that keeps it honest. The same institutions that dismissed him are the reason the rib survived at all, cataloged and protected for 30 years until the technology arrived. Gatekeeper and archive in the same building. Nobody apologized. The field does not apologize. It adjusts. The old story was not a lie. It was just too small.